The overpass at mile marker 47 wasn't much, but it was home. A concrete shelf tucked beneath the highway where the trucks rumbled overhead like distant thunder and the rain couldn't reach if you pressed yourself against the back wall. Marcus Webb had been living there for 8 months now, ever since the shelter on 5th Street filled up and the waiting list stretched longer than his patience. He'd made it comfortable, in his way. A sleeping bag he'd pulled from a dumpster behind the sporting goods store, a tarp strung up to block the wind, a milk crate that served as chair and table and storage all at once. It wasn't much, but it was his. Marcus was 54 years old, though he looked older. The years had carved themselves into his face. The sun and the wind and the things he'd seen in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He'd done 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, had earned medals he'd since pawned and scars he couldn't sell. He'd come home to a wife who'd stopped waiting and a job that had been filled and a country that thanked him for his service with one hand while pushing him to the margins with the other. He didn't blame anyone. That was the thing people didn't understand about Marcus. He wasn't angry. He was just tired. Tired of fighting for things that never came. Tired of hoping for a break that always went to someone else. Tired of explaining his situation to social workers who nodded sympathetically and then told him there was nothing they could do. So he'd stopped explaining, stopped hoping, stopped fighting for anything except the next meal and the next night and the small daily victories that kept a man alive when everything else had been stripped away. This morning, those victories included a can of beans he'd found behind the grocery store and half a loaf of bread that was only a little stale. He'd built a small fire in the metal drum he kept for that purpose, and he was heating the beans over the flames, watching the bubbles rise and pop when he heard the footsteps. Marcus tensed. Footsteps under the overpass usually meant trouble. Kids looking to hassle the homeless guy, cops coming to move him along, or worse, other men from the camps who'd decided his spot looked better than theirs. He reached for the piece of rebar he kept beside his sleeping bag, not threatening, just ready, and turned to face whoever was coming. The man who emerged from the shadows wasn't what he expected. He was big. That was the first thing Marcus noticed. Broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of build that came from years of physical work or physical violence or both. His hair was gray and cropped short, and his beard was neatly trimmed in a way that suggested discipline. He wore a leather jacket, cracked and worn at the elbows, with a patch on the back that Marcus couldn't quite make out in the dim light under the overpass. And he was limping. Not a bad limp, but noticeable, the kind of hitch in a man's step that came from an old injury acting up, or miles walked on feet that weren't meant to walk that far. He moved slowly, carefully, one hand braced against the concrete pillar for support, and when he saw Marcus watching him, he stopped. "Easy," the man said. His voice was low and rough, scraped thin by something, exhaustion maybe, or pain. "Not looking for trouble, just need to rest a minute." Marcus studied him. The leather jacket, the boots, the way he carried himself despite the limp. This wasn't a street person. This was someone else, someone from a different world, who had somehow ended up under the same overpass on the same gray morning. "Long way from the highway," Marcus said. "Bikes don't usually come down here." The man's mouth twitched. "Bike broke down about 2 miles back. Fuel line cracked. I've been walking since dawn." "That's a long walk with a bad leg." "Yeah." The man eased himself down onto a chunk of concrete, wincing as his knee bent. "It is." Marcus watched him for a moment longer, then made a decision. He turned back to his fire, picked up the can of beans, and carried it over to where the stranger sat. "Here," he said, holding out the can. "It's not much, but it's hot." The man looked at the beans, then at Marcus, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the particular kind of confusion that came when the world did something unexpected. "I can't take your food." "You can if I give it to you." Marcus set the can on the concrete beside him and went back to his milk crate, picking up the bread. He tore it in half and brought one piece back. "You look like you've had a rough morning. I've had plenty of those. Least I can do is share what I've got." The man stared at him. In the growing light, Marcus could see his face more clearly now, weathered, lined, carrying the weight of years and miles. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky before a storm, and they held a steadiness that Marcus recognized. He'd seen that look in the mirror once, a long time ago, the look of a man who had been through things and come out the other side. "Why?" the man asked. Marcus shrugged. "Because you're hungry, and I've got food. Doesn't have to be more complicated than that. The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the can of beans and took a bite, chewing slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus. Marcus Webb." "Earl," the man said. "Most people call me Shepherd." They ate in silence, sharing the bread and the beans, while the traffic rumbled overhead and the morning light crept slowly under the overpass. Marcus didn't ask questions. He'd learned a long time ago that questions were a luxury, and most people's stories were heavier than they looked. He just ate and waited and let the stranger have his peace. When the food was gone, Shepherd set down the empty can and looked around the camp. His eyes moved over the sleeping bag, the tarp, the milk crate, with its careful arrangement of possessions: a flashlight, a paperback book with a broken spine, a photograph in a plastic sleeve that Marcus kept face down so the rain couldn't get to it. "How long have you been out here?" Shepherd asked. 8 months, give or take." "Before that?" "Shelter on 5th Street. Before that, a room I couldn't afford. Before that—" Marcus stopped, shook his head. "It's a long story." "I've got time." Shepherd shifted his weight, easing the pressure on his bad leg. "My bike's not going anywhere until I can get a tow, and that's going to take a while." Marcus looked at him, this stranger who had stumbled into his camp, eaten his food, and was now asking for his story, like it was something worth hearing. He didn't know why, but something in Shepherd's face made him want to talk. Maybe it was the steadiness in those gray eyes. Maybe it was the fact that he'd accepted the food without pity or condescension, like one man to another, equals in their hunger. Maybe Marcus was just tired of being silent. "I was in the Army," he said. 3 tours overseas. Came back in 2012, thought I'd pick up where I left off, but there was no left off anymore. Wife was gone. Job was gone. I bounced around for a while, construction work, warehouse stuff, whatever I could find, but the nightmares made it hard to keep anything steady. The drinking made it harder." He paused, staring at the embers of his fire. "I got clean 4 years ago, but by then, I'd already lost everything. No credit, no references, no address. You try getting a job when you can't put a phone number on the application. Try renting an apartment when your last landlord evicted you for unpaid rent." He shook his head. "The system's not built for people like me. It's built to keep us where we are." Shepherd listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, he nodded slowly, like he was filing the information away somewhere important. "You served," he said. It wasn't a question. 12 years. "What unit?" 3rd Infantry Division. Saw action in Fallujah, Kandahar, a few other places they don't put on the news." Something shifted in Shepherd's expression. A recognition, maybe, or a deepening of the respect that had been there since Marcus handed him the beans. "I was Army too," Shepherd said. "Long time ago. Before I found the road." Marcus looked at him with new eyes. The bearing made sense now, the way he carried himself, the discipline in his movements, despite the pain. "What outfit?" 101st Airborne. 2 tours in Vietnam." Shepherd's mouth twisted. "Came back to people spitting on us at the airport. Took me a long time to find my way after that." They sat in silence, 2 veterans from different wars, connected by something that didn't need words. The traffic rumbled overhead. The fire crackled and popped. And for a few minutes, the space under the overpass felt less like a camp and more like a sanctuary. Shepherd reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. Battered, old, but functional. He dialed a number and spoke quietly for a few minutes, arranging something Marcus couldn't quite hear. When he hung up, he looked at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. "Tow truck's coming," he said. "Should be here in an hour." "Good." Marcus stood and started gathering the remains of their meal. "You can wait here if you want. I don't have much, but you're welcome to the shade." Shepherd didn't move. He sat on his chunk of concrete, watching Marcus with those steady gray eyes. "You gave me your food," he said. "Your only food, without knowing who I was or what I could do for you." Marcus shrugged. "You were hungry. I had food. Like I said, doesn't have to be complicated." "It's more complicated than you think." Shepherd stood slowly, favoring his bad leg. "The world doesn't work that way for most people. They see a man in a leather jacket. They see trouble. They see a man under an overpass. They see trash. But you—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You saw a person. That's rare, Marcus. Rarer than you know." He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a card. He held it out, and Marcus took it automatically. "If you ever need anything," Shepherd said, "anything at all, you call that number. Someone will answer." Marcus looked at the card, white, simple, with a phone number and a logo. a horseman carrying a shepherd's crook. On the back, 2 words, Iron Horseman. "What is this?" he asked. "Family," Shepherd said. "The kind you choose, not the kind you're born with. We look out for each other, and we look out for people who deserve it." He nodded at Marcus. "You deserve it." Before Marcus could respond, the distant sound of an engine echoed under the overpass. A tow truck was coming down the access road, its yellow lights flashing against the gray morning. Shepherd shook Marcus's hand, a firm grip, calloused and strong, and started walking toward the road. At the edge of the overpass's shadow, he turned back. "Thank you for the meal," he said. "I won't forget it." Then he was gone, climbing into the cab of the tow truck, disappearing down the highway like he'd never been there at all. Marcus stood in the silence of his camp, the card still in his hand, and wondered what had just happened. He looked at the phone number, at the Horseman logo, at the words Iron Horseman that meant nothing to him and everything to someone. He tucked the card into his pocket, next to the photograph he never showed anyone, and went back to his fire. He didn't know it yet, but that meal, a can of beans and half a loaf of stale bread, had set something in motion that would change his life forever. 500 miles away, in a warehouse on the outskirts of Tulsa, a man named Shepherd was making phone calls, and the Iron Horsemen were starting to ride. The days after Shepherd's visit passed the way days always passed for Marcus, slowly, quietly, measured in small tasks and smaller victories. He found another can of food behind the grocery store, this time peaches and heavy syrup that tasted like summer, even though autumn was settling into the bones of the world. He patched a hole in his tarp with duct tape he'd salvaged from a construction site. He walked 3 miles to the VA clinic for his monthly check-in, sat in the waiting room for 4 hours, and was told that his housing application was still being processed, just like it had been processed for the last 2 years. He didn't think much about the man called Shepherd, or the card that was still tucked in his pocket next to the photograph. Strange things happened to people on the margins. Strangers appeared and disappeared. Promises were made and broken. Hope flickered and died so often that most people stopped noticing the flames. Marcus had learned to take each day as it came, to expect nothing, to be grateful for what he had, instead of mourning what he didn't, but he kept the card. He didn't know why. Something about the way Shepherd had looked at him, the steadiness in those gray eyes, made him want to believe it meant something, even if believing was dangerous, even if hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. 4 days after Shepherd left, the weather turned. It started with a cold front that swept down from the north, dropping temperatures 30 degrees in a single afternoon. By nightfall, the wind was howling under the overpass, cutting through Marcus's sleeping bag like it wasn't there. He huddled against the back wall, his breath fogging in the air, his fingers going numb despite the gloves he wore. He'd survived worse. The mountains of Afghanistan in winter, the deserts of Iraq in summer. But each year it got harder. His body was 54 years old, and it remembered every mile, every wound, every night spent in conditions no human being should have to endure. By morning, he was shivering uncontrollably, his joints aching, his chest tight with the beginnings of something that felt like it might become pneumonia. He'd been sick before, out here. He knew how fast things could go bad. A cough became a fever became an infection became a body found under an overpass by some highway worker who would shake his head and say, "What a shame," before going back to his warm truck and his warm life. Marcus thought about the VA clinic, but it was 3 miles away, and he wasn't sure he could walk that far. He thought about calling 911, but he'd learned the hard way that ambulances didn't always come for people like him, and when they did, the bills that followed were worse than the sickness. He thought about the card in his pocket, the phone number, the Horseman logo, the promise of help that probably didn't mean anything. He pulled it out and looked at it for a long time. Then he walked to the payphone at the gas station a quarter mile down the road, the last payphone in this part of the city, kept operational by some miracle of bureaucratic inertia, and dialed the number. It rang twice before someone answered. "Iron Horseman, this is Red." Marcus's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the cold. "I'm looking for someone called Shepherd. He gave me this number a few days ago." "Who's calling?" "Marcus Webb. He came through my—" He stopped, not sure how to describe his camp, his home, the concrete shelf under the overpass. "He came through where I stay. His bike broke down. I gave him some food." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Hold on." Marcus waited, his breath fogging around the receiver, his free hand shoved deep in his pocket for warmth. The wind cut across the gas station parking lot, scattering trash and dead leaves. He was about to hang up, about to decide this had been a mistake, that the card meant nothing, that hope was just another form of self-destruction, when a different voice came on the line. "Marcus!" It was Shepard, unmistakable even through the static of the old phone. "You called. You said to call if I needed anything." "I did. What do you need?" Marcus hesitated. He'd spent so long not needing anything, not asking for anything, that the words felt foreign in his mouth. But his chest was tight, and his hands were shaking, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his drill sergeant was telling him that pride was a poor substitute for survival. "I'm sick," he said. "We're getting there. The cold, it hit hard, and I don't have—" He stopped. Tried again. "I don't have anywhere warm to go. The shelters are full. The VA can't see me for a week. I just thought—" "Where are you?" "Pay phone at the Chevron on Route 12, near mile marker 47. Stay there. Don't move. Someone will be there in an hour." The line went dead. Marcus hung up the phone and leaned against the booth, his head spinning. He didn't know what he'd expected. Maybe a referral to another agency. Maybe a polite suggestion to try the shelter again. Maybe nothing at all. He hadn't expected "someone will be there in an hour," spoken with the certainty of a man who meant every word. He waited. 53 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled into the gas station parking lot. It was old, battered, the kind of truck that had seen decades of hard use and kept going anyway. A man climbed out of the driver's seat, young, maybe 30, with a shaved head and tattoos climbing up his neck. He wore a leather jacket with the Iron Horseman patch on the back, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. "Marcus Webb?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "I'm Tiny. Shepard sent me." He looked Marcus over, taking in the pallor of his skin, the tremor in his hands, the way he leaned against the phone booth like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You look like hell, brother. Come on, let's get you warm." He helped Marcus into the truck, cranking the heat until the cab felt like a sauna. They drove in silence for 20 minutes, heading away from the city, into the countryside where the buildings thinned out and the land opened up into fields and forest. Marcus watched the world pass by through the window, too tired and too sick to ask where they were going. They pulled up to a house, a real house with a porch and a yard and smoke rising from a chimney. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, the kind of place that had been built by hands that knew what they were doing and maintained by people who cared. "This is the way station," Tiny said, cutting the engine. "It's where we bring folks who need a place to land. You can stay as long as you need." Marcus stared at the house. "I don't understand. Why would you do this for me?" "Because Shepard asked us to." Tiny opened his door and came around to help Marcus out. "And because you're a veteran who shared his food with a stranger, that means something to us. That means your family." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Family. He hadn't had family in years, hadn't had anyone who would notice if he disappeared, anyone who would come looking, anyone who would say his name with warmth instead of pity or disgust. "I can't pay you," he said. "I don't have anything." "Nobody's asking you to pay." Tiny guided him up the porch steps. "Just get better. That's all we want." The door opened and warmth spilled out, real warmth, the kind that came from a fire and a roof and walls that kept the wind away. A woman stood in the doorway, middle-aged, with graying hair and a face that had seen hard times and come through them with her kindness intact. "You must be Marcus," she said. "I'm Ruth. Come inside. I've got soup on the stove and a bed made up. You look like you could use both." Marcus let himself be led inside. He let Ruth settle him on a couch near the fire, let her press a bowl of soup into his hands, let her drape a blanket over his shoulders that was softer than anything he'd touched in months. He ate, and he warmed, and slowly the shivering stopped, and the tightness in his chest began to ease. When the bowl was empty, Ruth took it from him and set it aside. "There's a doctor coming tomorrow," she said. "One of ours. He'll check you over, make sure you're on the mend. Until then, you rest. That's an order." Marcus looked at her, at the fire, at the room around him filled with furniture and photographs and all the small signs of a life lived in one place for a long time. "Why?" he asked. It was the same question he'd asked Shepard, the same question he couldn't stop asking. "Why would strangers do this for me?" Ruth sat down in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Because my husband was like you once, she said. A veteran, homeless, lost in a world that didn't have room for him anymore. Someone helped him when he had nothing, gave him a meal, a bed, a chance. That man was Shepard's father. He started the Iron Horsemen to make sure no one else had to go through what he went through alone. She paused. When you helped Shepard, you became part of that story, part of our family, and we take care of family. Marcus didn't know what to say. He sat there in the warmth, the fire crackling, the soup settling in his stomach, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. He felt safe. Get some rest, Ruth said, standing. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Why? Marcus asked. What's happening tomorrow? Ruth smiled, a small, knowing smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. You'll see, she said. You'll see. Marcus slept for 14 hours straight. He didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember. He just sank into the mattress like a stone dropping into deep water, and when he surfaced again, the light through the window had changed from the gray of evening to the gold of morning. His chest still ached, but the tightness had loosened. His hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he woke up warm. The doctor came mid-morning, a quiet man in his 60s with steady hands and a bag full of equipment that looked older than Marcus felt. He listened to Marcus's chest, checked his temperature, asked questions about his medical history that Marcus answered as honestly as he could. When he was finished, he packed up his bag and nodded. Upper respiratory infection, he said. Not pneumonia, not yet, but it would have gotten there if you'd stayed out in the cold. Antibiotics, rest, and fluids. Ruth will take care of you. How much do I owe you? Marcus asked. The doctor looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and pity. You don't owe me anything, son. That's not how this works. He left, and Ruth appeared with a tray, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, and a small cup holding 2 pills. Marcus ate everything, took the medication, and lay back against the pillows, watching the light move across the ceiling. I still don't understand, he said when Ruth came to collect the tray. All of this, the house, the doctor, the food, for a stranger who gave someone a can of beans. It doesn't make sense. Ruth set the tray on the dresser and pulled a chair up beside the bed. Let me tell you a story, she said. About 40 years ago, a young man came back from Vietnam. He was angry, lost, addicted to things that were slowly killing him. He'd seen his friends die, done things he couldn't talk about, and come home to a country that didn't want to hear it. He lived on the streets for 3 years. Would have died there, probably, if a stranger hadn't found him one night in an alley behind a bar. She paused, her eyes distant. That stranger was a truck driver named Earl Combs Sr. He didn't know the young man, didn't know him anything, but he saw a veteran shivering in an alley, and he couldn't walk away. He brought him home, got him clean, helped him find work, saved his life. She looked at Marcus. That young man was my husband. He died 8 years ago, but before he passed, he started the Iron Horsemen with Earl's son, the man you know as Shepard. They built it on a simple idea. No veteran left behind, no one forgotten, no one alone. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the infection. The man in the alley, he said. Your husband. What was his name? Thomas Grant. Ruth smiled, soft and sad. He used to say that Earl's kindness was the first domino. Every person we help, every veteran we bring in from the cold, that's another domino falling. The chain keeps going, Marcus. You helped Shepard when he needed it. Now we help you. Someday, you'll help someone else. That's how it works. Marcus stared at the ceiling, processing. He'd spent so long believing he was invisible, that the world had written him off, that no one cared whether he lived or died. And now, here was this woman, telling him he was part of something bigger, part of a chain that stretched back decades and forward into a future he couldn't see. I don't know if I have anything to give, he said quietly. You have more than you think. Ruth stood and smoothed the blanket over his legs. But right now, your job is to rest and heal. The giving comes later. She left him alone, and Marcus lay in the warm bed, listening to the sounds of the house. Footsteps, distant conversation, the clatter of dishes in a kitchen, normal sounds, human sounds, the sounds of people living their lives together, connected by something stronger than blood. He fell asleep again, and this time he did dream. He dreamed of sand and gunfire and faces he hadn't seen in years. He dreamed of the overpass, the cold, the endless parade of days that blurred into each other like watercolors in the rain. And then he dreamed of something else, a road stretching into the distance and the sound of engines, and a feeling he couldn't name but recognized anyway. Hope. He dreamed of hope. 2 days passed. Marcus grew stronger, his cough fading, his appetite returning. He learned the rhythms of the way station, breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Other people came and went, most of them veterans like him, all of them in various stages of recovery from whatever had knocked them down. They talked or didn't, shared stories or kept silent, and nobody judged. It was the first time Marcus had been around people who understood, without being told, who looked at him and saw a person instead of a problem. On the third morning, Ruth woke him early. "Get dressed," she said, laying a set of clean clothes on the foot of the bed. "We're going somewhere." "Where?" "You'll see." They drove for half an hour, Ruth at the wheel, Marcus watching the countryside roll by. The land was flat here, farmland giving way to scrub, the highway cutting through it like a scar. Ruth didn't explain where they were going, and Marcus didn't ask. He'd learned to trust her over the past few days, to believe that whatever was happening had a purpose even if he couldn't see it. They turned off the highway onto a county road, then onto a gravel path that wound through a stand of trees. And then the trees opened up, and Marcus saw it. The overpass, mile marker 47, his home. But it wasn't his home anymore. The concrete shelf where he'd slept for 8 months had been transformed. A tent stood where his tarp had been, not a cheap camping tent, but a solid canvas structure with walls and a floor and a door that zipped shut. Beside it was a wooden platform, raised off the ground, with a propane heater and a small table and chairs. There was a cooler, a camp stove, a rack hung with pots and pans. There was a stack of firewood, neatly split and covered with a tarp. There was a flagpole, and at the top of it, an American flag snapped in the morning breeze. And there were motorcycles, hundreds of them, filling the access road, spilling onto the grass, lined up in rows that stretched further than Marcus could see. Ruth parked at the edge of the crowd and turned to Marcus. "Welcome home," she said. Marcus couldn't move. He sat in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the scene before him, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His camp, his lonely, forgotten camp under the overpass, had become something else entirely, something that looked like it mattered. He opened the door and stepped out. The crowd parted as he walked forward, bikers in leather and veterans in the old uniforms, men and women who nodded at him as he passed like he was someone worth nodding at. He walked toward the overpass on legs that didn't feel like his own, toward the tent and the platform and the flag that flew above it all. Shepard was waiting for him. He stood at the edge of the platform, his gray beard trimmed, his slate-colored eyes steady. He looked healthier than he had that morning under the overpass, rested, strong, like the miles and the pain had been washed away by something Marcus couldn't name. "Marcus," he said, "what do you think?" Marcus looked at the tent, at the heater, at the flag. He looked at the hundreds of bikers who had gathered to rebuild a homeless veterans camp. He looked at the sky, blue and clear, and the highway overhead, where the trucks still rumbled like distant thunder. "I don't understand," he said. His voice cracked. "Why would you do all this?" Shepard stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "Because you shared your food with a stranger," he said. "Because you served your country, and your country forgot about you. Because no one should have to live like you were living, and if we can change that, we will." He paused. "You're not invisible, Marcus. You never were. We see you, and now you'll never be forgotten again." Marcus felt the tears come, and for the first time in years he didn't try to stop them. He stood under the overpass where he'd spent 8 months alone, surrounded by 500 people who had come to tell him that his life mattered, and he let himself cry. The crowd began to applaud, not loud, not raucous, but steady and warm. A sound like rain, like healing, like the first domino falling in a chain that would stretch on forever. And Marcus Webb, homeless veteran, forgotten soldier, stood in the middle of it all and finally believed he was home. The work took 3 days. What had started as a simple camp became something more, a permanent structure built to last through winters and summers, storms and heat. The Iron Horsemen had brought everything, lumber and nails, tools and tarps, generators and propane tanks. They'd brought skilled hands, too, carpenters and electricians, plumbers and welders, men and women who knew how to build things that would stand. Marcus tried to help, but they wouldn't let him. "You're still recovering," Shepard said when Marcus picked up a hammer on the first morning. "Your job is to rest and watch. The work is ours." So Marcus watched. He sat in a folding chair near the platform, a blanket over his shoulders despite the warming weather, and he watched 500 people transform his life. They built a wooden frame around the tent, insulating it against the cold. They ran a line from a solar panel array to power lights and a small refrigerator. They dug a fire pit lined with stones and built a shelter over it so he could cook in any weather. They installed a chemical toilet behind a privacy screen and a solar shower bag that would give him hot water when the sun was strong enough to heat it. It wasn't a house, but it was more than Marcus had ever imagined having again. On the second day, a truck arrived carrying something Marcus didn't recognize at first, a small prefabricated structure, the kind used for construction site offices. The bikers unloaded it and set it up beside the platform, running electrical lines from the solar array and insulating the walls with foam board. "What's this?" Marcus asked Shepard, who had been directing the installation. "Your new bedroom." Shepard opened the door, revealing a space just big enough for a bed, a dresser, and a small desk. "The tent's good for living, but you need a place that's truly weatherproof. Somewhere you can lock up, keep your things safe." He paused. "Somewhere that's yours." Marcus stepped inside. The walls were plain but solid. The floor was level and clean. There was a window that looked out on the camp, and a door with a lock. And for a moment, Marcus couldn't breathe. He'd spent 8 months sleeping on concrete, guarding his few possessions against theft, never fully closing his eyes because closing your eyes meant vulnerability. And now he had a room with walls and a door and a lock, a room that was his. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough. "You don't have to thank us." Shepard leaned against the doorframe. "Just live. That's all we ask. Live and heal, and when you're ready, help someone else the way we helped you. That's how you thank us." On the third day, the work was finished. The camp under mile marker 47 had been transformed from a desperate shelter into something that looked almost like a homestead, organized, functional, built with care and intention. The flag still flew above it all, snapping in the wind, a declaration that someone lived here and that someone mattered. The bikers gathered for a final ceremony. They stood in a loose circle around the platform, hundreds of men and women in leather and denim, their faces serious and proud. Marcus stood at the center, still not quite believing any of this was real. Shepard stepped forward, holding something in his hands, a folded flag, the kind given to families of fallen soldiers, the kind Marcus had seen draped over too many coffins in his time. "This isn't a funeral flag," Shepard said, reading his expression. "It's a new beginning flag. We give one to every veteran we help as a reminder that their service is honored and their sacrifice remembered." He held it out. "Welcome to the Iron Horseman family, Marcus. You've earned your place." Marcus took the flag with trembling hands. The fabric was heavy, the folds precise. He'd carried flags like this before, had handed them to widows and mothers, had watched them clutch the fabric like it was all they had left of someone they loved. But this one was different. This one was his. "Thank you," he said. It was all he could manage. The crowd applauded again, and then the ceremony was over. Bikers came forward one by one to shake Marcus's hand, to clap him on the shoulder, to welcome him to a family he hadn't known existed a week ago. Some of them were veterans too. Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they traded stories and units and the names of places only soldiers knew. Others were civilians who had joined the Iron Horsemen because they believed in the mission, in the idea that no one should be left behind. By evening, the crowd had thinned. Most of the bikers had ridden out, heading back to their lives in cities and towns across 4 states. But some stayed, Ruth and Tiny and a handful of others who had become familiar faces over the past few days. They gathered around the fire pit Marcus had never had, cooking dinner over flames that crackled and popped, talking and laughing like they'd known each other for years. Marcus sat among them, the folded flag in his lap, and felt something he'd forgotten how to feel. Belonging. He belonged. After dinner, when the fire had burned down to embers and the stars had come out overhead, Shepard found Marcus sitting alone on the platform, looking up at the highway where the trucks still rumbled their eternal song. "How are you doing?" Shepard asked, settling into the chair beside him. "I don't know." Marcus shook his head slowly. "A week ago, I was dying under this overpass. Now I've got a room in a camp and 500 people who showed up to help me. It doesn't feel real. It's real. Shepard stretched his bad leg out in front of him, grimacing slightly. The nightmares you're going to have tonight, wondering if you'll wake up and it'll all be gone. Those are real too, but so is this. He gestured at the camp, the tent, the flag. So am I. So are the brothers who built this. We're not going anywhere, Marcus. Why me? Marcus asked. The question had been burning in him for days. There are thousands of homeless veterans out there, tens of thousands. Why did you choose to help me? Shepard was quiet for a long moment. The embers crackled. The highway hummed. Because you gave me your food, he said finally. Because you didn't ask who I was or what I could do for you. You just saw someone hungry, and you helped. That's rare, Marcus. People talk about kindness, but most of them don't practice it. Most of them walk past people like you and me without seeing us at all. He paused. You saw me. You fed me. And in doing so, you reminded me why we do this, why any of it matters. He turned to look at Marcus, his gray eyes steady in the firelight. Every person we help is a chance to push back against the darkness. Every camp we build, every veteran we bring in from the cold, is a statement that the world can be better than it is. We can't save everyone, but we can save some, and those some can save others, and on, until the chain stretches further than any of us can see. Marcus thought about that. He thought about the can of beans he'd shared, the bread he'd torn in half, the simple act of kindness that had brought him here. You really believe that? He asked. That one small act can change things. I've seen it. Shepard stood, his joints cracking, and put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. I've seen it 100 times. I saw it the day you gave me that meal. I'll see it again, the day you help someone else. He squeezed once, then let go. Get some rest. Tomorrow's the first day of your new life. Don't waste it. He walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel, and Marcus sat alone under the stars, the flag in his lap, the fire dying to embers beside him. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow was the first day of his new life. He looked at the camp around him, the tent, the platform, the small room that was now his. He looked at the flag overhead, still visible against the dark sky, still snapping in the wind. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Webb looked forward to waking up. 3 years later, on a morning that felt like the one where it all began, Marcus Webb stood at the edge of his camp and watched the sun rise over the highway. The camp had grown since those first days. What had started as a tent and a platform had become something more, a small community tucked beneath the overpass, with 3 permanent structures now instead of 1. The original room Shepard had given him was still there, weathered but solid, but beside it stood 2 others, built by the iron. Horsemen for veterans. Marcus had found himself. There was David, a Marine who'd done 3 tours in Iraq and come home to a foreclosure notice, and a wife who'd stopped answering his calls. Marcus had found him sleeping behind the gas station on Route 12, the same station where he'd made the phone call that changed his life. He'd brought David back to the camp, given him food and warmth, and called the number on the card he still carried. And there was Elena, an army medic who'd served in Afghanistan and returned with injuries both visible and invisible. She'd been living in her car when Marcus met her at the VA clinic, waiting for an appointment that kept getting pushed back. He'd offered her a place to stay, a meal, a community. She'd accepted, wary at first, then grateful, then part of the family. The camp under mile marker 47 had become something Marcus never expected, a way station, like the house where Ruth had nursed him back to health, a place where veterans could land when they had nowhere else to go, a first step on the road back to life. The Iron Horsemen had made it official 2 years ago. They'd given Marcus a title. Camp Commander, they called it, though he thought that sounded too grand for what he did, and resources to keep the operation running, solar panels and propane deliveries, food drops, and medical supplies. Once a month, Ruth drove out with a truck full of whatever they needed, and once a year, on the anniversary of the day Shepard had stumbled into his camp, the whole club gathered for a reunion that filled the access road with motorcycles and the air with the sound of engines. Marcus had changed too. The gaunt, desperate man who'd shared his last can of beans with a stranger was gone, replaced by someone stronger, steadier, more certain of his place in the world. He'd gained weight, lost the cough that had plagued him for years, and found something he'd thought was lost forever: purpose. The nightmares still came sometimes, the faces of the men he'd served with, the sounds of combat, the the smell of sand and blood and fear. But they were quieter now, less frequent. He'd started talking about them, first to Shepard, then to Ruth, then to a counselor at the VA who actually listened. The talking helped. The community helped more. This morning, he was expecting a visitor. The motorcycle appeared on the access road just after 7, its engine a familiar rumble that Marcus recognized before he could see the rider. He walked to the edge of the camp and waited, watching the bike approach, watching the man on it slow and stop and swing his leg over the seat. Shepard looked older than he had 3 years ago, more gray in his beard, more lines around his eyes. But his presence was the same, that steady, certain energy that filled whatever space he occupied. He pulled off his helmet and walked toward Marcus, his bad leg barely noticeable anymore. "Marcus," he said. "Shepard." They shook hands, then embraced, a brief, firm hug between two men who had been through something together and come out the other side. "Place looks good," Shepard said, looking around. "Better every time I see it." "We try." Marcus gestured toward the camp. "David's out on a job interview today. Elena's at a doctor's appointment, a real one, not the VA runaround. They're doing well." "Because of you." Marcus shook his head. "Because of you. Because of the club. I just do what I can. That's all any of us do." Shepard walked toward the platform where the flag still flew, faded now but still strong. "I've got news. Good news or bad news. Depends on how you look at it." Shepard turned to face him. "The city's been talking about this overpass for a while now. They want to expand the highway, add another lane. That means construction. And construction means this camp can't stay where it is." Marcus felt his stomach drop. 3 years of work, 3 years of building something that mattered, and now they were going to tear it down. He should have known. He should have expected it. Nothing good lasted forever, not for people like him. "When?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. 6 months, maybe 8. Shepard paused. But that's not the whole story. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Marcus, who opened it with hands that were suddenly unsteady. It was a deed. A property deed with Marcus's name on it. "The club bought some land," Shepard said. 10 acres, about 3 miles from here. Good soil, clean water, room to build something permanent. We want you to run it." Marcus stared at the paper, the words blurring in front of his eyes. "Run it? A real facility, not a camp, a home. Transitional housing for veterans with beds and showers and a kitchen. A place where people can stay while they get back on their feet for as long as they need." Shepard put a hand on his shoulder. "We've been planning this for 2 years, Marcus. Raising money, finding land, getting permits. It's finally ready. And we want you in charge." Marcus couldn't speak. He looked at the deed, then at Shepard, then at the camp around him, the structures he'd built, the lives he'd helped, the community that had grown from a single can of beans. "Why me?" he asked. It was the same question he'd asked 3 years ago, standing in this same spot, overwhelmed by a kindness he didn't understand. "Because you know what it's like." Shepard's voice was gentle. "Because you've been where they are, and you found your way out, and you've spent the last 3 years helping others do the same. Because you have something that can't be taught. Compassion. Real compassion, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return." He squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "You gave me a meal when you had nothing. That one act set all of this in motion. The camp, the club's involvement, David and Elena and everyone else you've helped. It all started with a can of beans and a man who chose kindness over self-preservation." He paused. "That's why you, Marcus, because you've already proven who you are." Marcus looked at the deed one more time. 10 acres, a real facility, a chance to help not just a few veterans, but dozens, maybe hundreds over time. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly. "You can." Shepard smiled, and the hardness in his face softened. "You've been doing it for 3 years. This is just the next step." They stood in silence for a moment, the highway rumbling overhead, the flag snapping in the wind. Marcus thought about the morning Shepard had stumbled into his camp, limping and hungry and alone. He thought about the meal he'd shared, the call he'd made, the chain of events that had led him here. He thought about all the veterans still out there, sleeping under bridges, behind dumpsters, in cars and alleys, and places no human being should have to live. He thought about what it would mean to have a real place to bring them, a place with beds and walls and doors that locked, a place where they could heal. "Okay," he said. The word came out rough, but certain. "I'll do it." Shepard's smile widened. "I knew you would." They walked back to the camp together, talking about plans and timelines and all the work that lay ahead. David returned from his job interview. Successful, he said, his face bright with something Marcus recognized as hope. And Elena came back from her appointment with news that her disability claim had finally been approved. They celebrated that night around the fire pit, 4 people who had found each other in the darkness and built something that mattered. Later, after David and Elena had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to embers, Marcus sat alone on the platform, looking at the stars. He thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, homeless, sick, invisible. He thought about the man he was now, camp commander, future director, part of a family that stretched across 4 states. He thought about all the small moments that had led from one to the other, all the acts of kindness given and received, all the dominoes falling one after another. He pulled out the card he still carried, worn soft now, the edges frayed, but the number and the logo still visible. Iron Horseman, a horseman carrying a shepherd's crook. He didn't need the card anymore. He had the number memorized, had the club on speed dial, had brothers and sisters who would answer any time he called, but he kept it anyway. It was a reminder of where he'd been and how far he'd come. A reminder that one small act of kindness, a can of beans, a piece of bread, a moment of compassion, could change everything. Marcus tucked the card back into his pocket and looked up at the flag, still flying, still snapping in the wind. Tomorrow, he would start planning the new facility. Tomorrow, he would begin the next chapter of his life. Tomorrow, the chain would continue, stretching forward into a future he couldn't see, but finally believed in. But tonight, he just sat under the stars in the camp he'd built, surrounded by the family he'd found, and let himself be grateful. He was home. He was whole. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And somewhere out there, in cities and towns across the country, other veterans were sleeping under bridges and behind dumpsters, waiting for someone to see them, waiting for someone to share a meal, make a call, start a chain. Marcus would find them. One by one, he would find them, and he would bring them home. That was his mission now. That was his purpose, and he would never stop. Not as long as there was one more veteran in the cold, one more person who needed help, one more chance to push back against the darkness. The fire died to ash. The stars wheeled overhead. And Marcus Webb, once forgotten, now found, closed his eyes and dreamed of everything that was still to come.